So again, for those of you, probably people are spread around the country, both DC associates, but also summers from different parts of the country. And we realize this is just such a strange experience for all of us. Legal Aid has been getting some excellent trainings from an organization called the Wedge Center for Grieving. And one of their mantras is, no one has done this before. No one has ever been through this before. And so, recognize, and I'm sure you're hearing this all the time from your firms and from other places, that, we wanted to present sort of as much normalcy as possible and give you some content that we hope you will find interesting. And we just recognize that these are strange times for our country and frankly, the world. I think we probably waited enough time, and we want to be respectful of everyone's schedules. Somehow the way my screen works, Ted Howard is the second person I get to see. And so I will Ted, why don't you quickly just introduce yourself and say hi to all these folks.
Good afternoon, folks. It's my pleasure to participate in this program this afternoon. I appreciate the invitation from Eric and Heather. I am the pro bono partner at Wiley Rhine LLP here in Washington, D.C. It's a position I've held since the summer of 2014. Before that, I was a partner in one of the litigation practices at the firm. I serve on a number of boards of legal services organizations. For the last 5 years, I've been a member of the ABA Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants. And I am a little bit different than many of my colleagues in the Association of Pro Bono Counsel in that I maintain pretty much of a full-time active litigation practice in the pro bono area, as well as overseeing and managing my firm's program. So pleasure to be here and look forward to talking to you all a little bit later.
Thank you, Ted. And yeah, I should say that two of us are from Legal Aid. So Heather, do you want to start chatting and introducing yourself quickly?
Thanks, Eric. Hi, my name is Heather Latino. I'm one of the deputy legal directors at the Legal Aid Society, and I've worked, in addition to serving in this capacity, I also have supervised in both the consumer and the housing unit. So those are the areas in which I've spent a lot of time thinking and working on. I've also had the pleasure and honor of being able to serve as co-counsel on a case with Ted when I was working in the consumer unit. And so hopefully he'll talk a little bit about some of the work that he's done with our organization as well. But thank you everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it and appreciate having the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you, Heather. And I'm Eric Angel, the Executive Director of Legal Aid, which is DC's oldest and largest civil legal services program, and sort of the host of these webinars. And if you can join us for future webinars, that would be great. If there's any way to make this quasi-participatory, I ended up calling on a few of you guys who made the mistake of calling in early, so I could see you on video. But if you have sort of questions along the way, you please use the chat function or just speak up. But maybe we'll move on to the next slide, Caroline. I did want to, it's so hard to even talk right now and to function as if the world is still moving along its axis when there is so much suffering and grieving and challenges going on. In many ways, obviously, the suffering of our client community is not anything new, as well as the sort of profound inequality in our society. But I do think there has been something of a reckoning, and the tone of even these presentations, and frankly, the tone of the conversations at your law firms probably, and the tone of the conversations around your dinner tables is probably different because of what is going on and what we're sort of being awakened to, seeing before our very eyes. We're going to cover three different things. One is sort of just the gross economic and racial disparities in the district. The other is to start talking about how the poverty legal services community and legal aid has been responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we want to talk, obviously, both about the importance of the legal services community, but many of you, not all of you, but many of you are summering or are associates at law firms, and sort of to talk about the extraordinary importance of pro bono as a means to helping out your neighbors living in poverty. If we could go to the next slide, Carolyn. So at times when I give talks like this, I will actually say this is sort of an uncomfortable subject, which is to talk about inequality. It's actually in some ways less of an uncomfortable topic right now because it is so in the forefront of what I think society and certainly people in the district are thinking about. But DC, and realize some of you had intended to move to DC for the summer and weren't able to do so, but DC is just an amazing, vibrant, exciting city by most indicia, and US News Report does this sort of silly survey, but it is often considered one of the best places to live in the country and one of the best urban environments to live in the country. And yet our inequality in the district is so stark. In DC, and I've even seen some op-eds decrying the fact that the wealth inequality nationwide is like 8 times. So the average white household has 8 times the wealth of the average Black household. But you'll see what this statistic is right on your screen in DC, where the average white household has literally 81 times more wealth than the average Black household. And to see that the average Black household had a net worth prior to COVID-19 of $3,500 is really just terrifying, even for many of you some of you have this lived experience. Many of you have worked with people living in poverty, but the stark data is just really, sort of shocking. If we go to the next statistic, income inequality is sort of equally acute, and this data is slightly old, but I suspect it hasn't changed much. The district's highest income earners really bring in extraordinary incomes, as you know, and as many of the people at the law firms know. But the bottom 20% of DC have to survive on less than $10,000 a year. There's this thing called the Gini coefficient, which is essentially the income inequality. It's a global index for evaluating inequality. And if DC were a country, the DC's chief financial officer have found that our Gini coefficient we are much closer to perfect inequality than to perfect equality of income, and that our income inequality sort of is basically the same as places like Namibia or Lesotho. And so these are sort of the gruesome statistics in DC, and that was before COVID-19. If we could move to the next slide. I won't spend too much time on all of these points, but almost 1 in 3 kids live in poverty, and again, these are pre-COVID-19. And if you're looking at east of the river, it's 1 in 2 kids, and the poverty guidelines don't remotely accurately reflect what the cost of living in DC, so it vastly understates the difficulty of our client community. If you could move on to one more. So one of the things that has been so I'm not sure even the phrase stress-inducing, but is so scary about the COVID-19 crisis is right from the beginning, we had the feeling that it would exacerbate the extraordinary racial wealth inequality and the income inequality that we already have in the district. And that is unfortunately starting to bear fruit. The statistics on the health outcomes have been truly shocking, with Black residents accounting for 77% of the COVID-19 deaths, with 6-figure unemployment insurance claims, with the issues with respect to evictions and foreclosures. The newspapers trying to decide whether it is a flood or an avalanche of foreclosures and evictions that we're looking at the end of this. But either metaphor is obviously very scary. And so there's been sort of a massive impact on our client community. The mantra that I would like to sort of us to take for purposes of this conversation and for purposes of going forward is something the DC mayor has said, which is that we have a once in a generation opportunity to emerge from this crisis a less unequal and a more racially equitable society than we did before. Now, unfortunately, that's not remotely what's happened so far. What's happened so far is it is actually exacerbated on inequality, but I do have that as our aspiration. And with respect to the court has sort of, right now in the middle of the pandemic, the court is going through a leadership change. So there's a new chief judge candidacy going on. And there was a forum last night, and you should be on the lookout if there are any other forum over the course of the summer. But it was interesting to see that each of the three leading chief judge candidates were articulating, I think, their aspirations that somehow the changes that forced the court to go up close to 100% remote will result in us figuring out ways to improve the systems for our client community as opposed to making it worse. Let me turn to the next slide. And I think we gave Heather a slightly more happy, albeit still stressful, topic of talking about sort of some of the ways that our community has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Can I turn it over to you, Heather?
Be great. Thank you, Eric. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that Legal Aid and our legal services partners have been doing to try to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on low-income individuals, families, and communities of color. Once the pandemic hit, one of the things that we shifted to and have spent significant time on over the course of the past couple of months is on policy advocacy. And I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we've had some success with, which is one of the happier topics. With regard to evictions, the DC Council, we've advocated and we're able to get protections in place that so during the public health emergency, no evictions can be filed and landlords can't evict tenants from their units. And that's a protection that's currently in place at least through September 22nd, which buys a lot of our clients like a little bit of breathing room so that they can remain stably housed at this time when it's, people are scared to be going outside of their homes. You can only imagine like how terrifying it would be to face the loss of your home and trying to figure out how to relocate in the midst of a pandemic. We've also had success getting a foreclosure moratorium put in place for owner-occupied homes during the public health crisis. So that during this period of time, homeowners don't have to worry about foreclosure actions being filed and there's a ban or a bar on foreclosure auctions taking place. There have also been at both the local level and the federal level additional protections put in place so that homeowners have more flexibility to be able to defer some of their payments and make them up at a time when it might be more financially feasible for them. The other thing that our office has spent a lot of time working on is expanding the type of unemployment insurance that might be available to low-income workers or workers in general in the district, and expanded those benefits so that they apply to categories of workers who would not have otherwise been eligible. So a lot of the workers who are working on the gig economy wouldn't have normally had access to those types of benefits, and had some success getting them increased as well. There's a temporary increase of $600 for some individuals, which again buys a little bit of breathing room at an incredibly difficult time economically. Can we go ahead and move to the next slide? As Eric mentioned, a lot of our time has also been spent talking with the court and keeping in touch with the court about its plans for reopening. Right now, all of the court's operations are happening remotely, which is a significant shift in the way that we practice and in the way that the courts operate. And during this period of time, because of the shift, the court can't handle the same volume of cases that it handled in the past. And so we've spent a lot of time talking with the court about how best to prioritize cases, trying to really put an emphasis on those cases where people's individual liberties are at stake, where someone's safety is an issue, but deprioritizing other cases that really are not about public safety. And in some ways, this was made easier by some of our legislative successes, but working with the court so that the court's not pushing forward with eviction cases, with foreclosure cases. It's not prioritizing debt collection cases that are being filed by, companies that buy and sell debt to make a profit. And as the court is shifting, and we think maybe undergoing a shift that will be in place for years to come, and not just during this temporary period of time when you can't have large groups of people convening in a courtroom. We're also trying to work with the court around some of the issues related to remote hearings. So on one hand, there's an incredible benefit to our client community in not having to take the time to go to the courthouse for a hearing that might take 15 minutes, but requires, a low-income individual who might be trying to hold, keep a job to be at the courthouse all day, to handle like their legal affairs. And so not having to go to the courthouse can be a huge relief. Not having to pay for transportation, arrange for childcare, figure out how to get your kids dropped off early at school so that you can make it to court on time. All of those things are incredible challenges for our clients. And so the ability to appear remotely, we think will be a huge benefit, particularly for some of the more routine hearings that happen. On the flip side of that, as many of you may have heard, like the term digital divide is being used a lot at this period of time to describe the differences and some of the inequalities that we're seeing highlighted and amplified by the crisis. In the district, more than 24% of households lack access to broadband internet connections. And, for all of us who are depending upon broadband internet connections for, every aspect of our lives right now, I think that's a really important figure to think about. Remote hearings can also happen through the phone, but that's, not an option for some of our clients as well. 13% of residents in the district don't even have a connection to the internet through a mobile device. And for many of our clients, it's difficult to keep enough minutes on their phone to be able to sit, waiting to be called into a hearing, when you might be in a virtual waiting room for an hour at a time. So making sure that the court and other agencies like the Office of Administrative Hearings are really thinking about these issues as they're planning for remote operations, and making sure that you're taking into consideration all of these different aspects. We, in the past, we used to connect with a lot of our clients at the courthouse, like when they were there for their hearings, because that was more feasible than taking time off to visit legal service providers around the city to try to connect with legal assistants. We were able to reach, our most vulnerable clients by being available to them when they were going to be in court anyway. And part of what we've been working on over the past couple of months is really shifting the way in which we provide legal services so that we can make sure that we're still connecting and providing a really easy way to access legal services. And so one of the things that's come out of, the shift in the way that things are operating is setting up hotlines, creating one number so that anyone with an eviction case can call just that one number and be connected with any legal service provider in the district who's providing that type of legal assistance. And so setting up numbers, not only for eviction matters, but also for debt collection cases, family law cases, so that there's like a good, easy entry point to connect with legal services. And even as the court's operations have shifted to being remote, we've been continuing to represent and work with clients who have matters in DC Superior Court, but they're just appearing at those matters remotely, also before the Office of Administrative Hearings. And those tend to be emergency matters. Just to quickly share an example of what those can look like, one of our attorneys recently handled a hearing requesting a temporary order, an emergency order to get repairs at a unit where the client had been living but really hadn't been staying there. She had incredibly deplorable conditions. Her toilet was broken, the sink wasn't working, the shower wasn't working, the fridge and stove were both broken. And she'd been living in conditions like that for months, but was able to, stay with friends and live in different places. But once the pandemic hit, that was no longer an option for her to try to make do by staying with friends and family. And because her workarounds were no longer working for her, she sought our help. We were able to represent her at emergency hearing, where the court ordered that those repairs be made, and able to get those things in place for her at a time, when she really needed that assistance and needed it quickly. As you can see, we've also been incredibly busy fielding lots of calls with all of the changes in the laws, and changes in legal protections, and with court closures and agency closures. Our client community has a lot of questions and needs a lot of information about what's happening and what their rights are and what they can do. If we could shift to the next slide, the last piece that I wanted to talk about briefly is we've also shifted to providing a lot more outreach and public education than we've done in the past. So we're trying to use as many different avenues as we can to be able to reach clients who don't have the same mobility to get around the city. And so we've created a lot of fact sheets with answers to questions that people have about, I had a court hearing, do I need to go? Can I be evicted right now? Should I be paying my rent? Is there a rent freeze? Just to be able to help people find the answers that they need. We've also compiled a guide of non-legal resources, because what a lot of people calling our office need is to know, where can I go for emergency rental assistance? Where can I go to get food to put on the table this evening? Where can I connect with other services, free broadband? And so having those resources at our fingertips has been incredibly helpful. We've been placing a lot of outreach calls to follow up with clients, educate them about ways that they can access the stimulus payments that are available to them, especially for those communities who may not be getting them automatically, like some other communities are who normally file taxes, or have bank accounts already in place where funds can be electronically transferred. And then keeping people educated through other means, like webinars. One that I'd like to highlight is we've connected with an organization called the Washington Interfaith Network, which is a network of faith communities across the district, and we've given seminars and webinars to groups like that to provide information about what the current rules and regulations are and rights are related to unemployment compensation, but also related to stimulus payments, and then more generally about what people's legal rights are following the pandemic. And so that's what I wanted to highlight in terms of what we've been doing in response to the pandemic, and would like to turn it over now to Ted to talk a little bit.
Thank you both. For the folks who are not familiar or less familiar with this amazing organization, the Legal Aid Society, I think you have a little better feel now for why those of us who have the pleasure to practice law in this city think of legal aid as such a treasure. A couple of things that Eric and Heather touched on are actually somewhat relevant to my work on the ABA Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants. And I'll just spend a second on that. Our standing committee is known as SCLAID. That's Standing Committee for Legal Aid and Indigent Defendants. We basically support the community of legal service providers in both civil legal aid and public defense that do the on the ground, everyday, nuts and bolts work on behalf of the poor in both civil and criminal contexts. And one of the things that we've done recently in connection with the pandemic is to develop a resolution that we will be presenting to the ABA House of Delegates in August at what would have been the annual meeting in Chicago, which will now be a virtual meeting. and it relates to remote court proceedings. And basically, because of the way in which the pandemic arose and so suddenly, causing courts around the country to have to basically sort of adapt on the fly to a whole new situation, and figure out how they were going to do their work going forward. There's a whole wide variety of models that courts, state and federal, have adopted and implemented in order to be able to conduct their proceedings remotely. And apart from those jurisdictions like Alaska, where remote court proceedings are and have been a way of life for many years, it's really been a trial and error sort of experience, I think, for a lot of courts and a lot of jurisdictions. And we feel that it's very important for the ABA to endorse the principle that when we have a chance to take a breath and step back, we need to make sure that in conducting remote proceedings, which are beneficial for many of the reasons that Heather outlined for the poor, that on the flip side, there isn't any disparate impact or prejudice to communities of color or the underprivileged, resulting from the impact of court proceedings. Does implicit bias result in a different result for a white litigant as opposed to a litigant of color when their face shows up on the screen in a in a residential circumstance that makes it clear that they're not living in the suburbs in Northern Virginia like where my house is and where I am today. So it's an important resolution. It's gotten a lot of early support from other entities within the ABA, and we feel like it'll make a difference going forward by compelling state and local courts and federal courts to convene committees of stakeholders and interested parties to evaluate the substance and nature of remote court proceedings and their impact on those who have to experience those proceedings. So just a momentary digression, but I thought that worth adding to this discussion. One of the positives as well as sobering aspects of serving on a ABA committee that has a national focus is that we do get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly with regard to access to justice issues. And DC is a microcosm of what the world looks like on a national basis with regard to disparities in terms of income and the poverty chasm, it's sobering in this sense. Legal aid may be the oldest and largest legal service provider in the city, but we are blessed to be in a community that has so many really committed, really effective legal services organizations addressing various aspects of legal need. And we live in a community that is blessed with numerous law firms that have tremendous pro bono traditions and established pro bono programs and committed pro bono lawyers. And even still, with all of that, which makes DC a model for the country in many ways, the need, the access to justice gap, the need for people with legal problems to actually have access to counsel is still staggering. And so one of the neat things about being, a pro bono partner in a large law firm is that the opportunities to do really interesting, really challenging, cutting edge, impactful pro bono work are almost unlimited. The critical thing, I think, for purposes of today's discussion is that while death penalty litigation in Texas or impact litigation with regard to immigrants' rights in California, all of those sorts of things are sexy and attractive and interesting and challenging. The needs right here at home are staggering. And I think it is really our obligation, as well as an amazing opportunity, for us to have an impact right here at home in terms of our pro bono focus and our pro bono efforts. I've been fortunate enough to work with Eric and Heather on a class action several years ago that involved predatory practices by a property management company acting on behalf of landlords that were engaged in a nefarious scheme to separate low-income tenants from their housing. It was as challenging and as interesting and as fulfilling as any pro bono work that I've done. They are great colleagues, they're great lawyers. It was an important case. We got a wonderful result, and it was, you don't have to go looking for opportunities to do really meaningful and impactful work. I did another case with colleagues of Eric and Heather's in the federal district court here, another class action that would have been really interesting and challenging, but for the fact that the law firm on the other side, in a Fair Debt Collection Practices Act case, basically folded their tents after we survived their motion to dismiss and settled the case on terms very favorable to our class representatives in order to avoid the liabilities that they might have ultimately owed to a whole class of folks. So, I hope that those who are getting ready for their virtual summer programs or have already started in them, or who are incoming associates who are nervous about when they're going to get a chance to take the bar and all of that sort of thing. I completely sympathize with all of that. But I would encourage you to think about the fact that none of these unusual circumstances preclude any of you from getting involved, and getting involved right away is the best way to do it. I've been practicing for longer than I'd care to admit, and I think my only regret about my legal career is that I didn't do more pro bono work earlier than I started doing it. So get involved early. There's plenty of need. There are plenty of folks who need your help. It will make your heart feel good to do it, and it needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Ted. We sort of, that kind of finishes the formal presentation, but I won't let everyone go this early, because I think there are just a few more subjects. We'd love to take questions or comments from any participants if people feel comfortable doing so. But one question that I will sort of start things up with as we wait to see whether anyone will ask a question is sort of this notion that I think is there's this fundamental disconnect. And I think I'll ask Ted in the first instance, but obviously Heather can weigh in, which is this fundamental disconnect where we set up a legal system with extremely complicated rules, the use of Latin as a pretty common bit of lingo, And then the vast majority of litigants, at least in the civil courts in urban jurisdictions, don't have the benefit of a lawyer. And, what is from your vantage point, both as a pro bono lawyer and with respect to the SCLAID, how does society, both pre-COVID and post-COVID, respond to this sort of fundamental disconnect that no one would ever create a judicial system as complicated as we have if you had known on the front end that most people would have to wade through it without a lawyer?
Right. Well, certainly I think that to the extent that there was already fairly obvious problem in terms of the right to counsel and access to counsel for basic legal needs, it's only been magnified, I think, by the pandemic. People don't even know how to go about contacting somebody at the court to, ask the questions that they need to ask, even assuming that they know the right questions, to find out, what's supposed to happen now. I had this court date, it got postponed, or now they're telling me that the court is operating, virtually. What am I supposed to do? So while I think folks who are familiar with the realities on a day-to-day basis of what poor and underserved communities face as it relates to the justice system, and have focused for a long time to greater or lesser effect on what to do about the fact that this is a legal system made for lawyers. I think Jim Sandman is the one who frequently says this. But I think that as a result of the experience that we've had with the pandemic, I do believe that there will be even greater level of sensitivity to the need for innovative ways in which to simplify access to the system, even if you don't necessarily have access to an attorney. A whole wide variety of ways in which people can get information about, that they need in order to try to navigate their way, if they have to, by themselves, how to navigate their way through and get something that resembles justice.
Thank you, Ted. We had a private question, but it was an interesting one, which is what are the ways, and I don't know if this is true at your firm too, but what are the ways for legal assistants and non-lawyers to potentially get involved in pro bono? We're really exploring a lot of innovative ways to get legal services to our client community. And I have to say that it was somewhat comforting hearing the 3 chief judge candidates at minimum really express significant commitment to the DC courts operating differently as we come out of this pandemic. Mm-hmm. But one issue that I think is going to be needed is a massive outreach campaign to all the litigants with current pending cases, and whether there might be a role. We've already been exploring this with the law schools and law students, but certainly this could equally apply for legal assistants for once the high volume courts starting up again, but possibly even before then, significant outreach campaigns to, for instance, tenants with pending cases, to give them information about the court, information about how the court's WebEx system, and then even more importantly, information about connecting them to legal services lawyers. Heather, I may turn this over to you. It's less a question than a comment, but I think some of the observations we've had over the years that even when we send a letter to someone offering a free lawyer to them, that clients don't always take advantage of that. And the idea of using potentially legal assistants or law students to reach out and make the human connection, offering someone access to a lawyer, I don't know if that's one of those things. I think those are one of the things you've been working on as we try to emerge from the pandemic, both how to connect people remotely and sort of innovative ways to reach out to what will be thousands upon thousands of people with pending cases.
And even in like the past years, we've shifted to trying to do more outreach. And so like as part of our housing practice, we do have a segment of cases where we affirmatively reach out and promise that if people get back in touch with us, that we will provide an attorney. And it makes an incredible difference in the outcome of a case, whether or not someone is represented in an eviction case. So we know from doing this work and studying the results of it that it does make a tremendous difference whether an attorney is involved in the case or not. But even sending letters promising assistance, we find that like a lot of people don't end up responding. Maybe they don't see it, maybe they don't understand, maybe they think it's too good to be true, or they just don't recognize like how a lawyer might be able to make a difference in their individual case. And so having someone on the other end of a phone who can maybe walk through some of those questions and provide some of those answers, I think could be incredibly valuable. There's like obvious logistical challenges in that, being able to get information about all of the cases that are pending that would include contact information is challenging. Like when a case is filed by, a landlord as an example, or a debt collector as an example, and there's not always good contact information or contact information like phone numbers or email addresses for litigants on the other side. And so those are some of the challenges that we're facing, in trying to get enough information so that we can do that type of outreach that we think would have a really big impact on the ability to connect people to counsel.
Yeah, no, thank you, Heather. And we had another comment in there about, and Ted, maybe I'll throw this over to you at least a little bit to talk maybe about some of the things nationwide that are happening. But the idea that I think DC does have in some ways a lot of civil legal services lawyers, not nearly enough, but more than other jurisdictions, but that we really may be lagging in the use of non-lawyers to help resolve the access to justice crisis. And, basically, as I think everyone understands, but the law is like a guild system, and the bar has traditionally, its job was as a monopoly to keep other people out of it. Right. And while that system might make sense for very, where there's a plethora of resources and wanting to make sure there's expertise, to say to a low functioning tenant that their social worker can't help them articulate their claims is, I think, a remnant of what was well-intentioned rules, but sort of totally misguided. And I'm curious whether in some of your national contexts, you've seen sort of the use of navigators or the use of other options that aren't really happening in DC that you think help advance the cause.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you note, the ABA, traditionally was the sort of bastion of protecting the legal profession. In recent years, I think that has changed a lot. I think the leadership of the ABA over the last several sequences has been in the hands of folks who really get these issues and understand them and understand that, the access to justice gap cannot possibly be filled just on the basis of legal services lawyers and pro bono lawyers. And that for certain kinds of legal needs, there just isn't any good reason why, paraprofessionals or non-lawyer advocates, can't be extremely helpful. And whether it be in, sort of a formalized way, like the state of Washington, which, did create laws that basically allow for, paralegals who had a certain degree profile in terms of their education, allowing them to act as non-lawyer advocates, or, whether it's just the kiosk in the courthouse, manned by, folks who are not, licensed to practice law, but who certainly are capable of understanding, relatively simple set of rules and practices with regard to landlord-tenant matters or things of that nature, can be of assistance to folks without endangering in any way, the viability or the livelihood of, of fully licensed lawyers. And so certainly, my standing committee, which is the principal liaison between the ABA and the Legal Services Corporation, we are cheerleaders for innovative ways in which non-lawyers can be of assistance to folks who need help, as is the Legal Services Corporation itself. And so, I think we're at least moving in the right direction in that regard.
Thank you. You mentioned Jim Salmon earlier in the Legal Services Corporation, and you were about to quote from Jim, and the quote from Jim that I thought you were going to mention was something that I've heard him say a couple times, and he's not the head of the Legal Services Corporation anymore, but was until recently. And what he talks about sort of the national federal commitment to civil legal services, and says that, Americans spend more on Halloween costumes for their pets than the federal government spends for civil legal services for the entire country. And it is, so I do think one piece of it is definitely that we do need more lawyers, but I like the question, thinking sort of broadly about ways in which the court can behave differently and can allow other people to practice before them, allow other people to sort of both navigate things, but also help people articulate their claims. And the one thing that I think is interesting in DC is there's been more of an evolution that the notion of the judge as an umpire really falls apart if one side has, the professional assistance of high quality counsel and the other side doesn't. And the DC Code of Judicial Conduct was changed in the last number of years to really articulate that judges have an affirmative duty to attempt to elicit information from the unrepresented party to make sure that they actually understand their claims, and they have an affirmative duty to explain the law to the unrepresented. And while that sounds like it's small, that is something that is, doesn't happen, on a daily basis because the judges just don't bother or because they're too busy to do so. I don't know, Heather, if you have any final thoughts, or Ted, you want to throw in?
I had a question for Ted, which is like also a final thought on the remote hearings. Because I know, like, in talking about like implicit bias or like, how like remote hearings might play out, I know that like that is one of our concerns, is like what happens when you're having a hearing and in the background there might be like posters, artwork, other people, that
noisy children
that might impact, a court's decision. And I'm curious whether you've seen, like, other than training judges, which is like what Eric just alluded to, and can be helpful, have you seen like other places in the country like implement measures to try to like guard against or protect against those sorts of biases that might creep in?
Well, I mean, certainly I think perhaps not quite so much related to the pandemic, but absolutely in connection with what's been going on as far as institutional racism and law enforcement over the last several weeks. I mean, it has provoked some truly astounding public statements from courts, from a trial judge in a, civil court in Salt Lake City to, as recently as yesterday, a statement by the chief judge of the New York Court of Appeals, which many know is the highest court in the state of New York, about the need for comprehensive, systemic review of all court proceedings for the purpose of determining whether the way in which the rules are written or the way in which the procedures are carried out as intended have a racially disparate impact, as well as all of those rules that appear neutral on their face and practices that appear neutral on their face, but nonetheless, as a result of the impact that they have on a particular demographic, have a disparate impact. And so I think implicit bias and the way in which rules are applied, the way in which certain practices are employed, I think all of that is going to be under a microscope, in the next several years, and about time. But also, I think ultimately, I would hope when we come out on the other side of all this, just a fairer system for everybody that it impacts.
I like it. Let's try to end moderately positively on that note. We had it was a pretty long time ago, actually, but a legal aid client who had been falsely accused of abusing her child or neglecting her child. And it was a sort of shocking set of, this is a Black woman. You will not be surprised to hear once you hear the rest of the story, which is she had a child with severe health issues, and she was taking the child to the doctor. And the doctor at one of our major hospitals recommended a certain procedure. And she went to Johns Hopkins and got a different recommendation by a different doctor. And so she rejected the advice of the first doctor, who then proceeded to report her as if she committed neglect of her child for failing to follow his advice. And there was initially a finding against her. And it seemed impossible to believe that had I disregarded the advice for my child of one medical professional and went to another medical professional and got different advice and followed that advice, that any agency would have had the audacity to say that I committed neglect against my child. And we don't usually take those cases, but we were sufficiently outraged that we took the case to just undo the finding of neglect against her, just so it wouldn't be on her record. And but she said in a interview with us, in a conversation, I knew I was right, but I knew I needed to have someone on my side in order to be heard. And it is sometimes sad that people need someone on their side in order to be heard. But it is also, for all of you who are lawyers or near lawyers or legal assistants or paraprofessionals, you are the person who can help be on someone's side in order to help them be heard. So we recognize these are extremely trying times for our country, and it is a trying time to stay optimistic. But we are hopeful that at least here in the district, we can work with the courts and emerge with an improved legal system, improved access to justice, and improved, racial disparities. So thank you so much for joining us today. Let us know if you have any suggestions or observations, and please consider joining us for a future webinar. And thank you so much to Ted, Howard, and Heather Latino for joining us today, and for Caroline for excellently running the slideshow. So very nice to meet all of you guys, even if it's remotely, and thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you all.